I'm Sally Murdoch, the Communications Manager for the Oregon Wine Board, and I'm here with Lindsay Gallagher. She's the President and CEO of Visit Napa Valley. I want to set the stage a little bit and talk about what happened on the West Coast last year. In Oregon alone, we had 20 billion pairs of eyes on Oregon through articles that were in the media. And that was compared to 15 billion the year prior. That's a 33% increase of people's eyes that were on Oregon wine. However, it's probably not a surprise that the negative sentiment with COVID and smoke were much higher than the year prior. In fact, it was a 320% more negative news cycle than in 2020 than it was in 2019. Anyone who does media relations probably has had some crisis PR in their background. At the same time, you need to balance positive PR with the negative PR in all your messaging with media, because the positive PR affects the Oregon wine industry for the long term. We had wine advocate samples that needed to be shipped to our Oregon wine reviewer. We had Wine and Spirits looking for wine. James Suckling was asking for wine samples at the same time. Critical reviews that really need to happen at the same time as crisis so that you have a good balance. I can tell you that hearing Rob McMillan, at the EVP and founder of Silicon Valley Bank's wine division, say, "There's a lot of things I didn't see coming this year," brought me a little bit of solace to know we were all in the same boat. Another sense of solace was in speaking with Lindsay, now president and CEO of Visit Napa Valley, with her experience and what she experienced in Napa and California this past year. Lindsay, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about you?
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Sally. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Hello from the Napa Valley. It's a beautiful day here, and we are certainly glad that we have turned the page on 2020 and are looking ahead with optimism for 2021 and what that means for our wineries and for visitors to our world-class wine region. As Sally mentioned, I'm Lindsay Gallagher. I'm currently President and CEO of Visit Napa Valley. I had been with the organization a little under a year when we started the COVID crisis last year. So I'm now approaching my second year in the tourism industry, and it's certainly been a roller coaster ride of ups and downs over the course of the last year and a half while I've been here. Prior to joining Visit Napa Valley, I worked for 10 years for the California Wine Institute. Obviously, that's a statewide association with about 1,000 winery members, and I managed our California wine export program and the international marketing of California wines to 125 countries around the world. So I'm happy to share my perspective with everyone today on the realities of managing through crisis, both from a wine production and a wine region standpoint in terms of the messaging and the perhaps the term that I hear my colleagues at Visit California use, the reputation tarnish and the brand taint that comes with a cycle of wildfires several years in a row. And then we've added, of course, the COVID layer on top of that, and that has implications both in the wine space in terms of scoring and production and the day-to-day business of the wine region, but also has impacts on visitation and people being willing and able to come visit you in Oregon or us here in the Napa Valley as well. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind, needless to say, but I'm happy to share my perspective both from the Wine Institute and international marketing side of things, and also right here at home for me in the beautiful Napa Valley.
Great. I have just a few questions. I'm moderating, so Lindsay will be taking the bulk of this presentation. One thing I noted in our conversations and online is that you were on staff at the Today Show, and that must have helped your media understanding a lot through this crisis.
Absolutely. That was I have to say, I'm very happy to be here in the Napa Valley, but I also feel very privileged to have had my work business card address be 30 Rockefeller Plaza for a couple of years prior to Tina Fey doing the show 30 Rock. I had actually been with GE Capital in a financial services role right out of college. And at the time, General Electric wholly owned the NBC network. And so I was very happy to be able to make a transition over to the Today Show staff, and really got a fascinating real-time live news prior to the internet perspective at the Today Show that I think has been very valuable for me in unexpected ways in the rest of my career. So yes, happy
Great,
to have spent some time at 30 Rock.
great. Okay, so starting in the questions, first, I touched a little bit about the balance of positive and negative with PR. We started our talking to press about the issues that were facing us pretty positive, and then we had to balance it somewhere where we were saying things like, yes, we will have a lighter crop this year. You might see less Pinot Noir. However, we're going to have beautiful white wines in 2021. There was a lot of damage, but here's the heroes that emerged from the harvest. Did you guys in Napa always have a balance of messaging that you had to wade through?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, it's a similar struggle for all of us in these situations when you're in the news cycle, which you want to make that as positive as you can, but also you need to be based in reality. And the reality was in that news cycle when those images were going all around the world of California going up in flames. Sadly, we had Miguel Almaguer from the Today Show doing his stand-up live from Napa Valley
Mhm.
several times, telling the California fire story. And I've never so much wanted the Today Show to get out of here. I was like, stop
Right.
doing that in Napa, okay? Like, we don't want to be the lead for the story. But we find that in the Napa Valley, whether the news is good or bad, we are often, sort of the masthead for the story. And so anyway, we're used to having to navigate that. But certainly, what I started to say here with our latest round of wildfires, the news was wanting projections on how much damage, how many buildings, what's the economic impact, what's the impact on the vintage. And so we were, walking a really fine line of wanting to disclose as much as we knew, but at the same time, we were not ready to throw in the towel on the 2020 vintage. We were not ready to give up on it. And so I think it is really a finely nuanced message about leading with a positive and trying to end in a constructive place while also giving the information that the news cycle wants in terms of how many wineries have burned and how many millions of dollars of damage. But what we very quickly did was as soon as it felt safe and appropriate to do so, we began to focus on what remained and not
Mm.
what had been destroyed. So we have, back of the envelope, 500 wineries here in the Napa Valley. Around 10 of those sustained damage. So we were focusing on, well, there are still 490 wineries that did not sustain physical damage. Same thing with the crop and the harvest component. It was too early to tell, and we were comfortable saying that. We didn't. We are committed as a region to only releasing wines that meet a quality standard. That being said, there are still going to be fantastic wines from 2020 that are produced from the Napa Valley, smaller quantity, of course. But again, for us, it was about focusing on what remained versus what had been destroyed, and that was effective for us.
And I think you had an example of hotels too. 125 hotels of those. Can you
Two.
give some more? Two.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have, that's exactly right, Sally. We have 125 hotels, 5,500 hotel rooms in the Napa Valley. Two of those sustained significant damage or were destroyed. And so and that was around 100 to 125 rooms that were impacted. So we still have, 5,400 hotel rooms and 123 properties that were not impacted and are ready to safely welcome guests with all the COVID protocols.
Great.
The second piece of the story.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you appoint spokespeople, or was the majority of it you speaking to media, or how did you work that through, or did you have winemakers talking to press a lot?
We have so many great winemaker and winery owner spokespeople out there, and many of them have great relationships with media outlets. And so we certainly didn't try to get in the way of that, but I did make myself available on behalf of the tourism and wine industry here to speak with a number of media outlets and to sort of manage the message as you and I had just been discussing, that yes, we we are impacted, and the visuals are quite shocking. But the majority of the fire was happening in the hillsides here, not in the towns. Air quality issues aside, we were able to still welcome guests and to continue with business as usual. And so, I was telling that story as frequently as I could. And also, we as an organization work very closely with our vintner colleagues at Napa Valley Vintners. We were managing talking points and messaging in real time together, and making sure that we were providing talking points to all of our vintners who might also be speaking with media outlets during this crisis. And I think, obviously, most people are happy to hear that from me, but they also want to hear directly from the winemaker who has, a winery and a vineyard in an impacted area, and they want to get on the ATV and ride up the dirt road and see with the winery owner or the winemaker what's left. And that was happening and was very very impactful and meaningful. But it was also important that we in Napa Valley were helping those winery spokespeople have those positive messages, and trying to reinforce that all was not lost. And that the Napa Valley had not disappeared in this crisis. As a little anecdote, I will share, prior to taking this job at Visit Napa Valley, of course, I was working for the California Wine Institute back in 2017, when we also had our first significant round of wildfires. And I can tell you that the reputation tarnish was significant in countries like Japan or Sweden or Mexico or Canada. Really, the assumption was that the Napa Valley had burned and been obliterated. And so we had a lot of work to do. And that was, that's when social media is particularly helpful, where you can show images of, beautiful, greenery and blue skies and a healthy vineyard, and really, get those visuals out there to counterbalance those very memorable fire images. When you can show beautiful, clear day, nice air quality, when we can talk about vineyards being a fire break by and large, and being very effective in stopping the burn was in the vegetation around the vineyard. And often here, the fire didn't get any more than 3 rows into a vineyard. So that was a great story to tell about vineyards being a natural fire break and helping to protect our vineyard land and our wineries. So again, these stories were take on a life of their own, especially when they have an international scale, and when the imagery that's out there is so shocking and devastating, with flames in all directions.
And you're probably relying on international travel or tourists calling you and saying, is it safe for me to come? And I've seen these terrible photos and video. So you're combating the visit, plus you're combating the winemakers.
Wine quality. Absolutely. And, that's sometimes, after 2017, we were getting, inquiries from international journalists who are the scoring press for our wines, with concern about, at the time, the 27 vintage, and people still in 2018, 2019, wondering if they should visit Napa Valley or California because of, their perceptions of what had happened with the fires. And so that at the time was taking 2 or 3 years to overcome those perceptions. And so it's, again, as a wine region, I think it's important to help ground where the impact spots are. For us, it's by and large out, in our hillsides, and not in the valleys and towns where most visitors are. And so I think it's, to the extent possible, it's important to tell that as part of the story, so people can contextualize the impact, and it doesn't seem that your whole valley or your whole region is gone.
We definitely talked about that with Oregon, that it was site specific. That was a term we used a lot. And I don't know if that resonated as much with journalists or even tourists as it did with us, but the meaning behind that was that, yeah, it's ours is a big state. We've got 908 winemakers. Everyone is affected differently. So you took a pretty bold move with your pledge. I don't know if I could call it a pledge necessarily, but can you talk a little bit more about that? Just really getting ahead of the stories with.
Yeah, and this is a key learning for us from the 2017 vintage. Those 2017 fires happened really at the tail end of our vintage. And so, the majority of the harvest was already in. And so we really could, in good faith, isolate our talking around that vintage and say, the vast majority of that vintage was already, the grapes had been brought in. and that we needed to then sort of taste through and see how the vintage, revealed itself. And that, we had a lot of key learnings from 2017. Unfortunately, in 2020, our fires were in the, much earlier in the growing season. And us being a region that is 60% Cabernet Sauvignon, a late ripening varietal, there was potentially more impact to the 2020 vintage. But the key learning for us coming out of 2017 was a commitment on behalf of both growers and wineries, some very well-known wineries here in the Napa Valley, with an agreement not to release a vintage if it did not meet the quality threshold that would be expected on the world stage of the Napa Valley. And so that takes courage. That takes a financial commitment. And I'm proud to say that we, as a valley, have honored that from the 27 vintage forward, and we'll do the same thing in 2020. If a vintage, if a blend is not meeting a quality standard, if there are loyal consumers of your brand who have consumed it over several years, and this is going to be, the flavor profile might be significantly impacted, then our wineries will not release that wine, so that we maintain the integrity of the region first, and then of the brand and the site after that.
And what did that promise look like? Was that meetings? Was that paperwork? Was that all winemakers in the valley agreed to this, all 500, or was it just a core few?
Yes, and that's I think the beauty and the strength of the Napa Valley is that this is a very close knit and collaborative community. We have been through a lot of hardships, from phylloxera to other vine disease, prohibition, in the more recent history, earthquakes, fire, floods, you name it. We've been through it. And I think at the end of the day, this is a community of farmers who help one another and are committed to maintaining the stellar reputation that this valley commands on the world stage as a world-class wine growing region. So a lot of this conversation happens as a sidebar in committee meetings of the Napa Valley Vintners Organization, in community conversations, but very quickly the most significant and well-known of our vintners stepped up and agreed that this was the path forward for the Napa Valley. And I think, a little healthy peer pressure goes a long way in that regard. And no one wants to be the one to screw it up for the rest of us. So it is not a written pledge per se, or any kind of a document, but more a commitment and a sense of pride in this community and the reputation that we've built over 50 plus years of traveling the world and bringing our wines with us, that we need to uphold the integrity of consumer and trade expectations and make the difficult decision not to release a vintage if it's not going to meet that quality threshold. And so far, I think it's been very successful internally and externally.
And the winemakers that were, most in agreement with this were they chosen as spokespeople to talk to the press, or was that kind of a self-appointment, or how did you choose winemakers to speak to press?
Definitely a self-appointment. We have some, we're fortunate that we have some very well-known winemaking families here, and everybody is leveraging social media and communicating with a very engaged consumer base. And so we had, a handful of significant, well-known vintners who stepped out in front of this message and this commitment, and then saw many following suit, soon after that, agreeing that, we have a reputation of a region to uphold. And we certainly have had some challenging vintages, but we're going to have some real gems of wines to offer if we can all stick to this pledge, if you will, to maintain the quality standard that would be expected from the Napa Valley.
Sure. How about a crisis plan? Did you have a crisis plan, and how closely did you follow it, or did it change? I know we had drafted a COVID plan for the state. Things changed pretty rapidly, and we're just now coming up for air and able to maybe write this crisis plan ahead of heat season. Can you tell us about yours?
Yes, we have a binder and a flash drive, and we myself and I was in my first 6 months, we did a crisis communications workshop with our board, And all of that was, in the hypothetical at that point in time. And I'm happy to say that I do think that it is valuable. It is valuable to have a plan. It is valuable to rehearse that. It is valuable to engage key spokespeople or board members in that, in that planning process, to have that discipline when you're not in crisis. But the reality is, I have to admit that, I did not open the crisis binder, and there was not a playbook that we could follow these past 10, 11 months now, where we had our COVID layer. That's kind of been like the fog in the Bay Area here. It's been a constant 10 plus months of the COVID pandemic. Then in August, we had our first round of fires here in the Napa Valley. We got through that, and then we started to have air quality issues, smoke from fires outside of our region, which was almost more impactful because of an air quality standpoint than the fires themselves had been. And then surprisingly, we had a second round of fires. So we've had what I call our layers of crisis happening for almost a year now here in the Napa Valley. And the reality is that I'm very thankful that we sort of went through, the fire drill, the rehearsal. But when you were in the midst of this, you were sort of making decisions on the fly, and you were trusting both your head and your heart about what you need to share with the media. And really, it was day by day for us in terms of how we managed the message. And I came to work every day with my armor on and my sword out, ready to fight this battle on behalf of our vintners and our hospitality community. But the reality is, it's good to go through the training, but it was not. We were not using any printed playbook as we were navigating this and pivoting on a daily basis.
Okay. And on the same note, the talking points that you had, I think we were circulated your talking points. Those were mostly for winemakers to have in their back pocket, but you also had talking points that were for you to use that were yours privately, because you had different questions thrown at you, right?
Absolutely. So we had, those for me primarily in talking to the media, and those were changing literally on a daily basis. What was the air quality? Which direction was the wind blowing? And therefore, were any of the cities and towns at risk? And we had fires this last round on both sides of the valley. The Napa Valley is a relatively small region. We only produce 4% of wine from the United States, and we are 30 miles long and 5 miles wide at our widest point at the top end of our valley. We are bordered on either side by a mountain range, and we unfortunately had fire happening in both of those mountains simultaneously at the end. And so it was a lot of wind factor, and a lot of things were changing on a daily basis. And so we had, up to the minute updated talking points for myself. And then on a daily basis, we were working closely with the Vintner organization, the Napa Valley Vintners, was also updating at least daily their talking points for winemakers and growers and others who might be interfacing with media. So again, we definitely had the internal version, we had the external version, and then we also did have a set of talking points for media as well. So we would share those pretty freely, and those were evolving on a daily basis. But we had several versions of these key messages depending on the audience, and goes without saying, we were also updating on behalf of our visitor community as well, letting people know, should they still come this weekend? Well, if you're staying on the south end of the valley, it's probably okay. If you're intending to be in the north end of the valley, this weekend's probably not going to work out. And so there was a whole visitation component, messaging as well, to help make sure that we didn't turn off the lifeblood of our visitor serving businesses in the valley that were out of danger. But certainly we didn't want to send people into harm's way as well. So it was a delicate balance all the way through. But in summary, yes, we had many versions of key messages and talking points, depending on the audience and the outlet.
So how many, numbers wise, you have 500 wineries, you have spokespeople, winemaker spokespeople. About how many do you think you assign? 5, 6,
I think there were 10
10?
probably, and it's a good, these folks kind of, opted in or had relationships with media, the San Francisco Chronicle or, other broadcast publications. But I would say we ended up organically with about 10 folks who were out there, telling the ground level story from the Napa Valley. And, in addition to me trying to paint a positive picture and to pivot that message to again about what remained rather than what had been lost, it was really compelling to have those de facto vintner ambassadors being willing to take somebody up into their mountaintop vineyard and see what the extent of the damage was, or to take someone behind the Cal Fire barricades when they were allowed to go, and to be able to see if there was an impact to any of their winery facility, particularly those that were in the hills, which were likely to be the most impacted. And so those, there were so many great stories that came out of that from the ground level of, the winery A, lost their bottling facility and their tanks were impacted. And so winery B just down the street said, bring the grapes here. We're done and we're happy to crush yours. And
Hmm.
really so many great stories of this community coming
Mhm.
together to address that. And that was nice to be able to get out into the news cycle as well. It was about that resilience and that grit that we have here in the Napa Valley. Great stories of our hotel partners offering significantly discounted rates for any community members who were displaced because of the fires. Wonderful anecdotes coming from restaurants who were making meals for first responders and Cal Fire, and taking them up into the hills so that we could feed those firefighters that came from around the state and around the world, quite honestly, to help us fight those fires. It really, we were able to demonstrate that coming together and that resiliency of our Napa Valley community at the ground level. And I think that was, for me, that was the most rewarding part of the news.
Good. I remember we kept our positive stories on a blog. I just updated it almost daily, but also on a base camp site so that we could all of us people talking to the media could access those. But I remember one national media person calling me, and I was telling him how wonderful the community was, and he said, "Okay, I want to move there. I want to I want to come there. Maybe when the fire's over, but can I get there?" Like he said, "You guys are all doing a wonderful job telling me how wonderful Oregon is." And I was really proud that we were able to get that messaging out there, but he needed some fast facts, and I don't know if we had any for him, but we definitely could talk about how wonderful our community was.
I think it's
Um,
really important. Sorry to interrupt, but I think it's really
no, no,
important for your wineries and your visitor serving businesses. I mean, we all need to be aligned. I have a great working relationship, my team on the hospitality and the Visit Napa Valley side, with the vintners and the grower associations. And so I think it's really important that we all work together. We are on the same team. We want the same end result. And
mhm,
everybody comes at it from a different angle and different. We all contribute to pieces of the puzzle, but I think it's really important for us to look, externally like we're playing well in the same sandbox, and that we have each other's back, and that I encourage any vintners and growers who are listening, look to the trade association, find those talking points, be prepared with those messages, and at any opportunity you have to amplify and repeat those messages, that's when it starts to stick in. People need to hear things 7 times, I think, to effectively remember them. And so it's really great to have authentic spokespeople like vintners and growers. And I just would urge all of your vintner and grower community, when these things are happening, make sure that you're informed. Go to the association website, call your contacts on the association side, and help us to help you, so that
mhm.
we all are telling the right story for our region, and that the takeaway becomes the resilience of the community and how well we come together to fight this adversity. And it's less about the damage and the destruction and the building count of how many things were impacted. So
Sure. Did your winemakers have any issues with time, just finding time to talk to press, or finding time getting on their ATVs with the press member on the back? And like, how did they carve out time in the face of disaster?
Well, you have
or
to. Number one, you're in a disaster, and in our case, you're in the middle of harvest. Like it's game time in October here. End of September, beginning of October. We'd had some heat, which is what started the winds, which is what started the fires. But we were at the tail end. Brix levels were right where we need them, and then you have this happening as well. And so I think that our winemakers did a great job of incorporating a little bit of telling that story, along with managing through their own crises of, are we going to keep picking fruit? Are we stopping? Where are your fermentation tanks? Do you have power? Can you get to them? Do you need to do a pump over? Is there, what's happening from an operational standpoint? But I think that we had also learned, in particular from 2017, how long that negative news cycle can last if we don't break it down and embrace it and try to tell the positive piece of that story along the way. We saw
Mhm.
how hard it was to recover from the 2017 images and messages, and made it a priority to make sure that we were doing everything we could to be transparent and inclusive, of the media as this story was playing out. And I think we were able to strike an effective balance.
Mhm. Good. Um, what kinds of, I guess, before we get into some more lessons learned, I wanted to hear a little bit more about your Explore Your Own Backyard campaign. Was that conceived from Crisis, or was that just a happy coincidence that that came together?
No, that was completely conceived from crisis. But what we started to see, we were, going back to COVID. This is all pre-fire,
Mhm.
when we in California had been in shelter in place from, mid March until mid June. And so in mid June, we knew that we were, going to be, coming out of shelter in place. But we also saw the key travel trends and the visitation patterns, and knew to expect that our visitation would come largely from a drive market from within a 1 hour radius of the Napa Valley. Um, in normal times, we have 20% of our visitors are international, and more than half of our visitors come from outside of California. So Texas, the Chicago area, the Northeast, the Southeast, and that visitation we knew, because of the COVID challenges, was not going to be coming back in any meaningful way for a long time. So we, really doubled down our communication efforts and knew that we put a bullseye on the Napa Valley and drew concentric circles around and said, okay, the Sacramento area can drive, the Bay Area can drive, the South Bay, the East Bay. Thankfully, we have a lot of folks, and a big population base very near our wine growing region. We benefit from a lot of wide open space, and, have some beautiful amenities that you can enjoy. In addition to wineries, many wonderful things that you can enjoy outside here in the Napa Valley. And so from there, we created, together with the Napa Valley Vintners, our Napa Valley Spirit campaign, that was encouraging first people here in our own community, and then those in a drive market to come and explore their own backyard here in the Napa Valley. We had many folks who live in the area who would often travel to Europe in the summer and visit wine regions, farther away, and they couldn't do that. So we could invite them to come here to the Napa Valley and enjoy, all the wonderful things about our community that people from all around the world come to see. And so the tagline was sip, shop, dine, and stay here in
Hmm.
your own backyard, and encouraging people to enjoy their own backyard. And here locally with our residents, we were encouraging, our community to help jumpstart the economy and help keep our restaurants, number one, in business as we were navigating this pandemic. And so we tried to encourage them, to become ambassadors and become part of the solution by, supporting the restaurants, supporting the wineries, and taking a staycation right here in the Napa Valley. And then we also had a little bit of a different spin on that message for our drive market. But once again, we were letting everyone know that we were finally open again after,
Mhm.
3 months of sheltering in place. We also had to elevate the communication of our safety and wellness protocols in a way that we hadn't done previously. There were many things that we had always done in the background in that regard, in terms of cleanliness and wellness and safety. But that became a lead message in that June, July, August timeframe. What are all the practices and the protocols that we're doing from hotels to restaurants to wineries? How are we going above and beyond the required minimum in terms of COVID safety protocols to over deliver in that regard on a Napa Valley experience that is still iconic and aspirational, but yet at the highest standards of quality and safety in terms of the COVID protocols. So that's kind of the backstory of how we, together with the Napa Valley Vintners, created that Explore Your Own Backyard campaign. It was very successful over the summer as our epidemiology as a community had started to improve and we were able to do more things. We have taken the safety piece of this very seriously here in the Napa Valley. And I think we saw that play out in a very positive way in terms of the safety and the spread of COVID in our community. So we will continue to be in that reality, I think, for a long time. We're very thankful that we're making progress from a vaccine standpoint. But again, I think that drive market is going to continue to be important for us in the first 2 quarters of 2021 and perhaps even into the summer as we await more normal travel patterns on long haul travelers. And as the vaccine rollout improves on a national level, then we'll be able to welcome folks back again from farther away. But for the time being, we are happy to encourage everyone to explore their own backyard and help support our local businesses.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about the cleanliness? I mean, not cleanliness, but the having everything COVID friendly and things that businesses are doing in order to stop the spread of COVID and still invite people into their doors. Did you put that into messaging that got further out to media? Was that one of the how did you communicate those principles?
Absolutely. I mean, that was a fun challenge to try to have a luxury wine region premium spin on safety and wellness. It was really as the hotel started to open in June, it was really interesting. Most of that cleanliness, wellness type stuff was happening behind the scenes, right? You had a night crew that came, often it was a night crew that would come in and do the cleaning of the common areas and the front desk when there were no guests there. Starting this summer, as those properties reopened, that became a daytime crew. And that was something that people wanted to see when they were checking into their luxury property or resort or, downtown Napa hotel. They wanted to see those protocols and practices in action. We very quickly this summer, had to make a lot of adjustments to the service and the housekeeping component of things, to pivot for COVID protocols. As an example, you would check into your hotel here and housekeeping would not come into your room unless you requested it, throughout your entire stay. So that meant that we aren't, as a matter of course, we aren't changing sheets, we aren't changing towels, we aren't tidying the room. You're sort of being left alone during your stay. When a guest would check out, we would leave the room closed for 24 hours before the housekeeping crew would go in. The room would then get cleaned and turned over and be left for another 24 hours before a new guest was able to check in. And so that whole turn cycle from a hotel standpoint became a challenge because you had to have your rooms out of commission for several days before we could have a new guest come. Similarly with wineries, thankful we have beautiful outdoor spaces here and we're used to hosting people outside, but certainly we had to change what that wine tasting and service experience looked like at the winery level, as well with the restaurants. So I think it was challenging at first. It's become very natural though now that we're several months on the other side of that. And we're making great progress with vaccine, of course, but we're going to need to continue to implement these protocols at a very high level for the foreseeable future. So this is not something that we're going to dial back on or that's going to become less important. We're going to need to continue to prioritize that. From a Visit Napa Valley standpoint, we were committed to showcasing as many images as possible of what to expect for visitors before they came. So you will have to wear a mask here
Mhm.
everywhere you go in the Napa Valley. We encourage you to wash your hands and to watch your distance as well. You can only visit with your household pod. You will need to make a reservation now to visit a winery. The spontaneity has been taken away for the time being. You can't just, drive into the driveway of a winery and expect to be hosted for a tasting. It requires a little bit more pre-planning, but in the end, I think the experience is over delivering on expectations as well. Once you get to that well-known Napa Valley winery that you've been a fan of for a long time, and once you're seated with your household pod at the winery, you can take your mask off, and you would need to wear it again if you get up to use the restroom or move around. But once you're seated at that winery, I think you can have a fantastic experience that puts the COVID crisis in the distance for for a little
Mhm.
while. But again, this community has been very committed throughout this to not just meeting those minimum standards, but going above and beyond with safety and wellness protocols in a way that you would expect of the Napa Valley.
Good. Yes, yes. So I guess what's next? Can you give us some learnings starting from the crisis plan and filing it, rehearsing it? What 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 does it look like on a chronological scale of getting ready for the next heat season? Um, Start now writing that plan and put it in effect, and then get your messaging, or what kind of lessons did you learn, and how will you apply them to this year? And what can we
Well,
glean
in
from?
particular, I feel like we've been in a year of crisis. So my hope is that we get a little bit of a respite, and that this becomes, issue based rather than ongoing. That being said, we are, hard at work on what we used to call our dry season toolkit, and we are now calling a fire season. And that is a change in approach and vernacular, both at the Visit California statewide level, as well as us here in the Napa Valley. This is
So
not,
dry season and fire season.
yeah. So we used to call it dry season. We didn't say fire season. We under the assumption that it was an anomaly and not the norm.
Sure.
And now that we just had our third year in a row of significant impact, and under the leadership and guidance of Visit California at a statewide level, they are referring to a fire season, and we are doing the same here in Napa Valley. What that means for us, it's interesting. If you're Florida and you have a hurricane season, let's say, that happens in your shoulder season. That's usually, I don't know, July, August, September. That is not the height of visitation for the region. So people still travel there, but they know that there's a risk of a weather event. Here in the Napa Valley, our busiest and probably most iconic season for visitation is the harvest season, and that happens to unfortunately coincide with the pattern of fires that we've seen over the past several years. So we will still always happily welcome visitors here during harvest, but there is a little bit more of a risk of planning to come here. If you're planning to have a wedding or an event, there is a risk that it might have an impact because of a fire. And so what we're doing on the Visit Napa Valley side is trying to tell the story a little bit more of the other 10 months of the year. So yeah,
Mm.
it's beautiful here in February, as an example. The mustard seed starts to bloom, it's quieter, it's less crowded from a visitation standpoint. The rates at hotels and wineries and restaurants can be a lot more affordable. And for me, the November and February time periods are some of the most beautiful and somewhat undiscovered. So we're trying to help influence that concept of seasonality, to help isolate when the highest risk of fire is, but then also to encourage visitors to come here in the other 10 months of the year, in those other seasons outside of autumn and harvest. Have you experienced wine country in winter? Have you come to see us in spring? Have you come over the summer? And so I think that's a good content opportunity for us to help our winery and other visitor serving business partners blend their business over a year-round basis, but also take some of the risk out and the variability out of that September and October timeframe, which is when we're busy with harvest and normally would be the most busy with visitors. So, we will be working proactively on that in the weeks and months ahead. We had always promoted what we call our Cabernet season. That's the shoulder season between November and April. And so we will continue to do so once again, but I think we'll even expand that into, wrapping a little bit more into summer and into winter with our messaging about when it's a good time to come and visit the Napa Valley and what to expect. Certainly, we do have a season and it is cooler here, for example, in January than in other months. But if you're coming from the Midwest or New England, or, my family's from Vermont, our winter is a heck of a lot better than what they're facing right now. So it's still a great opportunity to come and visit us outside of that more well-known season.
Such a better risk. I mean,
Yeah.
with all factors. So,
Yes.
okay, smart. So I'm hearing a lot of looking at the positive and not flipping the script necessarily, but looking at a holistic view of your region and winemakers and saying, yes, there's the iconic time to come, but what about if you come this time? You will maybe get more attention even.
No,
You
well,
can
no, from the winemakers in particular, they can spend so much more time with visitors and tell the story and help people fall in love with your winery and your region. If you have the benefit of time when the wine's in the tank and you haven't started blending yet, come in those other seasons and you absolutely will get more attention. And the winemakers will be able to engage and embrace visitors more than they're able, unfortunately, to do during harvest when they're navigating so many more moving parts. So yes, absolutely. I think it's it can't just be myself and you, Sally, telling that story. It needs to be coming from the wineries and from the growers as well, helping to reinforce that there are many times of the year to come and visit and what the benefits are, in addition to that well-known harvest season.
Great, great. Any other lessons that you can impart? I think you've really given us some great information and fuel for this year.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I'm a big fan of the wines that you're producing, and we love our friends and neighbors to the north of us here. And so I just encourage everyone to hang in there. We are on the tail end, I hope, of this COVID crisis, and I think that we all have homework to do going into the spring and summer on the fire side of things. I think it's important to prepare, that your organization prepares, that you work with the vintners and the growers, and you need to review that playbook. You need to know what to expect. You need to go through literally the fire drill so that you're comfortable with it. And then you just have to take each day as it comes when you're navigating this reality. My hope against hope, as I knock on wood here at my desk, is that we won't be dealing with this fire component in 2021. But I do think, if we do, we are all going to be prepared for it, and we need to work together with our friends and neighbors, with our winery and tourism associations, and sing from the same song sheet, be using the same playbook, be reinforcing one another's message, be honest, be transparent, and just be ready for the daily battle that we've all been fighting. So thank you for including us today.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.